Often appearing as the final obstacle to overcome, final bosses have to perform a bit of a balancing act. If developers make them too difficult, then players might get frustrated with the game and give up on it, even if they are mere moments away from seeing the credits roll. Make them too easy though, and it will undercut the journey the player took to get there. After all, no one likes being simply handed a win after hours and hours of gameplay. A good final boss therefore needs to be a test of what the player has learned up to that point in the game. It doesn't necessarily have to be the hardest enemy in the game, as optional super bosses can readily fill that role for would-be completionists and thrill seekers, but it does need to keep players on their toes and make them earn that narrative closure. Every once in a while though, a final boss can cross over into the realm of that initial instance, deemed to be more than a reasonable challenge. These final bosses would require extra grinding for levels, stocking up on additional items and supplies, and perhaps even creating more customized strategies. And because of this, they would often live on in the collective memory of the fanbase as those bosses. In the Final Fantasy series, there are a few that have earned this reputation, and we've scoured the comments section of our previous video to find another suite of final bosses that you felt warranted being mentioned. And it's these picks that we'd like to focus on for today's video, the hardest final bosses as recommended by you, with the usual caveat that we're only focusing on one final boss per game. Now, it should again be stressed that these final bosses do not necessarily represent the ultimate challenge of any particular game. It's more that they are a representation of when the final boss balancing took a turn for the worse. And with that, let's dive in as we take a closer look at the delightfully devilish demigod of the world of darkness itself, the Cloud of Darkness, specifically seen within the Final Fantasy III 3D Remake. Older role-playing games can often be difficult to return to for modern gamers due to how no-nonsense the difficulty can be, and Cloud of Darkness from Final Fantasy III serves as a great example. For a long time, Final Fantasy III was exclusive to Japan, and due to its complexities, Square and subsequently Square Enix skipped remaking it for the WonderSwan and then skipped remaking it for the Game Boy Advance. This all meant that, through traditional means at least, it would not be until 2006 that North Americans would be able to play this classic title, with Europeans having to wait until 2007. And when they did, they were exposed to a role-playing game with old-school difficulty, an expanded narrative, and some added content. What really blindsided players with this version of the game though was the difficulty spike when it came to the final boss, Cloud of Darkness. Fought in the World of Darkness atop the Crystal Tower, the player would end up encountering this menace twice. In the first instance, it was encountered following the defeat of Xande, with the player forced to lose the fight for narrative purposes. It was then the second encounter that would prove to be the real final battle, but this came with a major caveat. Also residing in the World of Darkness alongside the Cloud of Darkness were 4 bosses guarding the Dark Crystals. Once defeated, the Warriors of Dark would appear to the player to offer their assistance in the final battle. If these warriors were not freed prior to re-challenging the Cloud of Darkness, players would quickly find themselves in another unwinnable battle, as the Cloud of Darkness would boast an unparalleled defensive stat and would be essentially impossible to kill. As there were no opportunities to save your game in the Crystal Tower, this meant a game over was a loss of potentially hours of gameplay, forcing the player to fight through multiple bosses and the entire final dungeon all over again before attempting to rectify the error. Even with the odds being tipped in the player's favour by freeing the Warriors of Dark though, Cloud of Darkness was still no slouch. Boasting 120,000 HP and a massive attack stat, Cloud of Darkness was also accompanied by 2 tentacles, each with over 60,000 HP, and these would need to be defeated if the player wanted to avoid taking extra damage throughout the fight. Now, it would be possible to defeat Cloud of Darkness by focusing it down and ignoring these additional threats, but the player would still be at the mercy of its bad breath attack, which peppered the party with harmful status effects, and its particle beam, which would deal massive non-elemental damage to the entire party. It meant that no matter how many things were stacked in the player's favour, a game over was only ever a few wrong moves away, and the looming threat of progress loss was all too real. Bahamut is one of the most recognisable summons in the Final Fantasy franchise, and has appeared many times throughout its history in a myriad of titles, often as a summon and sometimes as a boss, and sometimes with a meaningful connection to the final boss. Final Fantasy XIII-2 would then push this notion further through the appearance of Jet Bahamut. Serving as the ultimate form of Caius Ballard, Jet Bahamut was a formidable foe, and to make the fight even more imposing, he will be joined by Amber Bahamut and Garnet Bahamut. Unfortunately, unlike other fights featuring multiple targets, in this fight against Jet Bahamut, it was not possible to bypass the two additional dragons. Resisting magical and physical damage respectively, Amber and Garnet Bahamut had to be taken out before the player could have a chance of attacking and building stagger onto Jet Bahamut. After downing Amber and Garnet though, Jet Bahamut would then use Break Curse, an ability that would cause a variety of status effects to the party before moving in to take them on himself. When on the offensive, Jet Bahamut had a fair amount of attacks that could cause serious harm to the player, but the most notable were Judgment Blade, Dying Sun, and Abyssal Yawn. All of these dealt heavy damage, with Dying Sun and Abyssal Yawn having the added effect of causing wound damage, which lowered the player's maximum HP. Like other appearances of Bahamut throughout the series, no fight against the King of Dragons would be complete without a countdown timer to his signature ability, Mega Flare. And Final Fantasy XIII-2's version was no different, featuring a play on the ability in the form of Giga Flare. Jet Bahamut would begin the countdown timer to Giga Flare while engaging the party after its support was defeated, but it was also capable of reviving its fallen comrades. This had the potential to complicate things for the player if they weren't careful, as the power of Jet Bahamut's Giga Flare was dependent on the amount of dragons remaining when the timer hit 0. Bahamut and one other dragon still being alive would result in Giga Flare being upgraded to Terra Flare, but if all three were present, then the player would have to contend with Exa Flare. Only a party full of sentinels would have a chance of surviving this attack, meaning players really had to keep a number of plates spinning all at once to stay in the safety zone, because once Jet Bahamut pulled ahead, it would be very difficult to get back on the track to victory. Final Fantasy II has become notorious for its battle and leveling mechanics, not least because they could make encounters against some enemies and bosses extremely difficult to navigate. And perhaps the most extreme instance of this coming to the fore would be when squaring off against the Emperor. And for this video, we've chosen to highlight the iteration that appeared within the 20th anniversary celebratory release of Final Fantasy II, which could be found on the PlayStation Portable. Encountered on the top floor of Castle Pandemonium, the Emperor attacked hard and fast, inflicting status effects like Blind, Slow, and Curse on the player. Though he only had 15,000 HP, he had a massive attack stat and resisted all elemental damage in addition to absorbing status effects. To make matters worse, the Emperor had a little surprise in store. Alongside powerful magic spells like Flare 16 and Starfall 10, powerful physical attacks came with an added Drain Touch, meaning he could not only deal massive damage, but also heal himself in the process. This feature was especially nasty, as the Emperor was so strong that he could easily cause damage to the players even if they were decked out in Genji gear. It was for this reason that focusing on evasion would be recommended, as it had a much higher probability of being effective for the purposes of damage mitigation. The Bloodsword also had the potential to make this fight much easier, as it outclassed almost all other weapons in damage against the Emperor due to him not being listed as an undead enemy, and thus not negating the weapon's effectiveness. Even still, this fight was sure to keep players on their toes up until the end, especially when factoring in that the challenge of Castle Pandemonium encompassed more than just the final battle. Because to get to the Emperor, the player would have to traverse through a host of truly nightmarish regular encounters, such as the Death Riders. Battles that could stop a player's party in its tracks before they even had a chance to test their mettle against the Emperor himself. Now, no single antagonist from Final Fantasy is more recognisable by the general public than Sephiroth. And as Final Fantasy VII drew to a dramatic conclusion, players would square off against this devilish foe under the guise of Bizarro Sephiroth and then Safer Sephiroth. It should be said that these days, with countless guides available on how to break the gameplay systems of Final Fantasy VII, defeating Safer Sephiroth can be a walk in the park. But for those who are doing a more traditional organic run, this final boss can still pose quite the challenge, and it's no doubt why there were a few requests for it to appear within this list. Although technically the penultimate boss of the game, Safer Sephiroth was one of the most involved bosses of the main scenario. Similar to Kefka from Final Fantasy VI, the developers at Square threw the kitchen sink at the player and gave them a spectacle like they'd never seen before. Safer Sephiroth would start the battle by casting Wall on himself, Pale Horse would then follow, and this would frustrate players as it could inflict status effects such as Frog, Small, and Sadness, and this would then be followed by physical attacks that would blind and paralyze. In addition, Sephiroth could also cast the troublesome Break spell, causing petrification, and could dispel any buffs the player had set up. His most worrisome attacks though were Shadow Flare, which targeted a single character for up to 7,500 points of damage, Supernova, which reduced the whole party's health by over 90% and had the potential to cause Confuse, Silence, and Slow, and the dreaded Heartless Angel, which could drop the entire party's HP to 1, leaving them ripe for picking off if they were not quickly healed. While these things certainly kept players on their toes, what made Save for Sephiroth hard was that there were many conditions under which the player could actually buff the boss without even knowing. This was because under certain conditions, such as having party members at level 99 or using the Knights of the Round summon in the battle against Genova Synthesis, Save for Sephiroth's HP could be anywhere from its base amount of 80,000 all the way up to 400,000, with his offensive and defensive stats also getting boosted as well. As Final Fantasy VII was infamous for its optional Ruby and Emerald weapon fights, it should be clear that Save for Sephiroth is not the hardest boss in the game by a long shot. However, back when Final Fantasy VII came out, he could have represented the first major encounter role-playing game newbies had with a big bad, and it feels fitting that he would put up a solid resistance, giving newcomers and more long-term fans a nice challenge along the way. Next up, we have Orphan. And like Save for Sephiroth, the form of Orphan we're focusing on here is technically the penultimate fight of the game as opposed to the final form, which can be considered much easier. But as it's all part of the same fight, it feels fair to give this iteration the nod because this fight was nothing short of frustrating. Part of this will be because Orphan had 2 modes, and this would determine which abilities were used. In Consummate Light, Orphan would utilize party-wide attacks and would heal itself frequently, meaning the player had to keep outpacing its constant regen. In Consummate Dark, it would relentlessly attack the party with lasers, its file exploitation ability, and Chains of Torment, which would inflict poison and other status effects. While this relentless assault alone was enough to contend with, there were 3 other abilities that could also cause trouble. First of these was Merciless Judgment, an attack which did damage equal to 99% of each character's total HP stat, leaving them very open to attack. Second was Contamination, which caused up to 4 random status ailments on a single character. The worst though was Progenitorial Wrath, and this could be a real sticking point for the battle, as it had the chance to inflict instant death, and if this hit the party member, Progenitorial Wrath could end the fight immediately. To top it all off, when low on health, Orphan would go into its opposite extremes mode, and use abilities from both Consummate Light and Consummate Darkness, and if players took more than 30 minutes in the fight, Orphan would then cast Doom on the party leader. Following this infuriating encounter, the battle against Orphan's final form will be much more of a formality, the player even being granted a checkpoint, something we can only assume was an act of mercy on behalf of the development team. Final Fantasy IV, or Final Fantasy II as it was known in North America back in the 90s, would serve as a common point of entry for the franchise. But even though that was the case, the experience that greeted players around the world was not uniform, as the difficulty varied depending on what system you played on and where in the world you were based. It would remain that way for some time, but everything became much more consistent when Final Fantasy IV was released on the Nintendo DS. Remade from the ground up for this new system, the Final Fantasy IV Remake was designed to pose a real challenge for both new and returning fans of the classic title, a fact that was made quite clear with the game's final boss, Zeromus, who had been given something of a glow-up in terms of challenge. This meant that new players were in for quite a shock, but even familiar players who had ventured all the way to the bottom of the lunar subterrane to face Zeromus would be in for a rude awakening. To start, this version featured nearly 3 times the HP of the previous Zeromus iterations. This meant taking it down would require the best weapons, armor, summons, and spells the game had to offer. These would then need to be supplemented by powerful augments, a new feature to the 3D remake, which allowed the player to add additional active and passive abilities to their character, as well as affecting their character's stats upon leveling up. Even with this preparation, however, Zeromus still posed quite the threat. It would frequently use its signature black hole ability to remove negative buffs from itself and positive buffs from the player, and Big Bang would be there as an extremely damaging ability, capable of wiping out an underleveled or under-equipped party in an instant. The 3D version of Zeromus would also respond with counterattacks to specific types of damage, making it even more aggressive. It would counter summon magic with Osmos, holy elemental magic with Whirl, and other magic would prompt a response of Flare. And as if this wasn't enough, once its health got low enough, Zeromus would then spam Meteor and Whirl as a last resort. By remixing and buffing an iconic boss like this, Square really pulled a fast one, and gave overconfident fans familiar with the game a real run for their money. And on the subject of reworking older final bosses, that brings us onto the last entry of our list, which has been a real sore spot for our commenters ever since the release of the Pixel Remaster, and that boss is Chaos. As the first final boss in the series, Chaos from the original Final Fantasy has become both legendary and occasionally meme-worthy in the greater story of Final Fantasy as a whole. As one of the toughest encounters in the original game, Chaos has traditionally worn the crown of final boss as well, coming decked out with powerful spells, paralyzing attacks, and a bevy of defensive resistances with which to stop the player in their tracks. As the series progressed, however, Chaos unfortunately faded into the background, as new final bosses continued to up the challenge. This was due, in part, to the fact that Chaos's AI script was well documented by players, and his spells and abilities could be predicted with a high degree of accuracy, ultimately lowering the challenge. With the release of the Pixel Remaster though, it's safe to say that Chaos is back. Like all previous iterations, when Chaos was encountered in the Chaos Shrine of the past, players would find an array of familiar abilities. These would come in the form of higher level offensive spells such as Earthquake, Blaze, Tsunami and Cyclone, and defensive spells such as Haste and Curajar. These would then be complemented by powerful physical attacks capable of paralyzing party members. Where the difference came though between this Chaos and the Chaos of old was that instead of following a script that progressed through these abilities in a predictable way, these attacks would be chosen at random. This meant that any given turn, Chaos could use any ability, regardless of which ability he used last. And this change could lead to nightmare scenarios, such as Chaos casting Flare multiple times in a row, or spamming attacks with a chance of inflicting instant death, like Earthquake. Outside of this, it's worth noting that the Pixel Remaster version of Chaos had 10 times the HP of his original version, a trait inherited from the Dawn of Souls version. And this speaks as the perfect example of the Pixel Remasters being faithful to the original game, except when they aren't. And it all means that the final battle against Chaos has been transformed from an encounter that was manageable with a decent strategy to one that requires a lot more preparation and a slice of good luck. And that, as they say, is that. They were 7 of the hardest final bosses as recommended by you in the comments section of our previous video. Were there any that we still didn't mention though and you've come to hold a grudge against? Please share in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Elsa Claire Farron, Galcian Dikujata, Gregory, Justin Dent, and Zukan TDK, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.